Richard Wolff is back at it again. He's been killing it recently. He's focusing this time on global capitalism. And I think we need to talk about this because I know I've touched on this before where the United States is not what it once was. And I think some people keep feeling like we are going to bounce back to being number one and the best economically. I don't believe that's true. And there's a couple of things that point to a different direction. And Richard Wolff is going to get into that, and I'll chime in between. You have to understand that other countries, they found a way to really help their country, the leaders of those countries, and not just help their country economically and financially, but also to help the people. They're trying to find ways to help the people in their country. We don't have that here. We have a government that's willing to give billions of dollars to another country, but we have people setting up tents all across America. Let's get into this with Richard Wolff.
Now, in modern capitalism, particularly that in the West, we refer to it often with the adjective private capitalism. And I want to begin by talking about how private capitalism is turning more and more to an authoritarian state. And my focus is going to be on the United States because of its leadership and importance in the world of private capitalism. And all the word private means is that the capitalists, the employers, are not operatives of a state. They don't hold a position in a government. They are not a state official of any kind. They are private individuals who undertake privately run, owned production. And they have been, for most of the history of capitalism, leery of authoritarian states. They were not interested in them. They wanted the state to be weak, distant, and mostly to leave the private capitalist alone. They used the French phrase, leave me alone, laissez-faire, to describe the kind of capitalism they endorsed. And private capitalism has been the norm in the United States, Western Europe, Japan, the old centers of capitalism over the last century or two. Why then might they today be turning to an authoritarian state?
Mm-hmm.
What do I mean by an authoritarian state? I mean a state that is not only allowed, but welcomed to intervene in the economy in all kinds of ways that used to be taboo, that used to be opposed by private capitalists. Far from opposing it, now most of them welcome it. Yes, there are groups that still are leery about this and don't want it. It's not universal, but the shift is unmistakable. And I'm only going to have time to give you some examples of the shift as it's going on. One way to understand it is to recognize that words which were until recently celebrated are now denounced.
Mm-hmm.
Globalization. We were told from the 1960s onward that as corporations expanded around the world, they could become more efficient. They could get closer to the sources of inputs they needed, the natural resources, and so on. They could take advantage of lower wages to cheapen the prices of things we here in the United States or Western Europe or Japan consume.
And as those businesses started to expand, for example, businesses like Amazon and Walmart, they actually made things more difficult for the mom and pop shops, for small businesses. They actually made it so that if I go to the mall in Cambridge right now, most of the stores have closed. They can't compete. They can't compete with online shopping on Amazon. They can't compete with Walmart. Like the hardware stores, the local, saw one earlier today that was closed. The local hardware stores that people used to have in their towns and like their communities, a lot of those they're gone because they couldn't compete with the hardware section in Walmart, which was selling those tools for a lot cheaper. They couldn't compete. So you have to think about sometimes expansion is not necessarily the best idea. So you end up with fewer, smaller businesses. And then when we talk about global expansion, it gets to the point where if you want to save money, then you start sending parts overseas. Instead of Ford, for example, making their parts right here in the United States, let's send these parts over to China and Mexico and let them make the parts. And then we can lay off some of these employees. That'll save us money. And the CEOs continue to get richer. That's the thing about expansion.
So on. Globalization made capitalism more dynamic, more efficient. We were to celebrate it. And our political leaders, Republican and Democrat alike, fell all over themselves cheerleading for globalization and for the other big term, neoliberalism, whose idea was simply let these companies go around the world. Don't hold them back. Don't limit them. Don't regulate them. Let them go. Notice again, laissez-faire. Let them go. Let the private folks do what they want. The government should keep out of it. And the corporations went. They went all over the world, particularly to China, because the wages there.
Sorry, 1 second. I was making sure. It looks a little fuzzy. I don't know why, but here we go. So he's talking about the part where they started to go to countries like China, right? Because it's cheaper for them to do that. There were no limitations. They could go wherever they wanted to go, not thinking about how that would affect the economy here in the US and how that would affect businesses here and, of course, the workers.
Were much lower than in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And the market in China was growing faster than in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And if capitalists know anything, they know that if you want to succeed in competition, you better go where the wages are lowest and the market is growing fastest, because that's where you will succeed. Well, the problem is, over the last 30 to 40 years, as capitalists globalized, going to China as well as many other countries, and that was true not only of American capitalists, but of Western European and Japanese capitalists as well, the Chinese managed the process quite differently from the way other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the so-called Global South, how they had managed it. The Chinese made sure it would go to the advantage of development in and by China, so that by today, China has demonstrated that it got a bigger set of gains out of neoliberal globalization than the countries that invented and produced neoliberal globalization.
Now it has gotten to the point where the United States government, we heavily depend on those countries to produce. One of the biggest mistakes I think that happened was NAFTA. That's one of the biggest mistakes, sending all those jobs like overseas. You look at a city like Detroit, for example, and you see how at one point in time, a thriving auto industry in that city. So many people moved to Detroit for those jobs, to work in those factories. Capitalists got greedy, decided it would be cheaper to make the parts overseas. And you see what else happened to Detroit. Once the jobs started to leave, the people started to leave. And that includes the teachers. And they moved to places that have better salaries or still had a thriving economy for the most part. And then they had to close schools in Detroit. This is why when you hear Rome, my comrade from RBN, say he watched them close 40 schools in Detroit, this is still an issue. And this is why, because you look at these things and you just see that, like, it's a domino effect. All it takes is for one domino to fall, and then it affects other areas and other factors as well. So that's a big part of the problem. But you see how that happened. The jobs went away. Jobs go away. The people are going to leave. People aren't going to stay in a city where there's no jobs. They're going to have to leave and go somewhere else. They take their kids with them. When they leave, they take their wealth with them. And that's how you get a city like Detroit becoming the way that it did. Problem is, it's not even just Detroit anymore. It's happening all across this country.
Liberal globalization. A kind of surprise has dawned on the world. And why am I telling you this? Because you probably already know it. I'm telling you it because the competition from China particularly, but also now from its allies, particularly the so-called BRICS, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. China and these allies are now a bigger economic powerhouse than the G7, which is the United States and its allies in Western Europe, plus Canada and Japan.
Right. They are not relying on the U.S. to basically help them at all. All these countries that came together and said, let's, be a part of BRICS, they're even moving towards like having their own currency. They're not waiting on the United States. They don't care about this at all. So the thing is they are moving on without us, and they're not going to try to have any type of limitation put on them from the United States government. Now, how do they do that? By having their own currency. As long as they are attached to the US dollar, the United States will always be able to sanction them. You take away that attachment from the US dollar, you take away the ability for the US government to sanction these countries. And the US government knows that. And that is why the government is so heavily, honed in on attacking a country like China, because they know China does not need them. They see this now, but they're the ones that made it that way. When you sent all those jobs after you sent all those jobs over to China, when you sent all the business over there, what did you expect the people to do? Now you want to fault a country like China for being successful off of a model that you basically told them about. Think about it.
The BRICS alliance produces about 33% of the world's output. The United States and its G7 alliance produce about 29%. In many fundamental ways, the dominance of the old Western centers of capitalism, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, is over. And they have been and will continue to be replaced by the ascendancy of the BRICS alliance.
It's over. The U.S. had a really good run for quite a while, I think. But that has come to an end. For all the people who say we'll bounce back, we'll get back to where we were, I don't think so. I don't think so. Listen, think about how some of these countries have been exploited. Think about countries in the global South that have been exploited, not just by the U.S., the United States and Canada, actually, but also by Europe. We talked about this before when we went over the video from Second Thought about how some of these countries that have social democracy, like with Bernie Sanders, like champions, these countries like Denmark, etc. One of the reasons why they're able to have that is because they exploit the labor from the global South. So they may not exploit their own citizens. They're making sure they still get to have ample vacation time. They're making sure that if they have maternity leave, they can have 9 months of maternity leave after they have the baby. But they have been exploiting workers in the global South so that they can have those things. So you can't expect those countries in the global South, you can't expect them to just sit around forever and just continue to be treated this way. This is why you have a Brazil that is a part of BRICS. Lula knows this. They know this. So I don't believe that the U.S. economically will ever get back to the point that it was. And I think people need to start paying attention to this. And don't be surprised if you start to see more Americans leave the U.S. and choose to live abroad. That's another thing that's been happening. People leaving the U.S., moving to countries like Canada, moving to Brazil, In fact, I know 3 people moved to Brazil, moving to China. Like, this is not unusual. And I think that will become more common as things get worse.
To give you simply one indication, economic growth this year, 2023, is expected to be between 0 and 0.2% in Europe. In the United States, it's expected to be between 1 and 2%. In the People's Republic of China, it's expected to be between 5 and 5.5%.
You see the difference? That's what happens when you produce your own products, when you produce your own goods and services. There is a change.
Inflation in Europe is devastating, over 10% for the area. In the United States, it's bad, but 5%. The inflation rate in the People's Republic of China this year is 0.7%.
Ding, ding, ding. Everyone paying attention? The UK was hit pretty hard with inflation. We've talked about it a couple times on the show. Germany, we announced this like a month ago that Germany had officially entered a recession. Remember that? China seems to be doing pretty well. This is why, and I've said this before, why do you think the US government is trying to, I guess in a way, I don't want to say egg on China, but they're trying to, piss China off, basically, so to speak. Why do you think that? Why do you think Nancy Pelosi taking the trips to Taiwan, them saying that they're spying on us, all the kinds of, why do you think they're trying to push? Because they see what's happening economically. There's a doctrine, we talked about this before, the Wolffman's doctrine, which basically said that the US government was the only one that was allowed to basically be number one and police the world. A real doctrine. So that means that any other country that becomes competition for the United States, the US government is going to try to find a way to keep them down. That would be a China and that would be a Russia. So people have to pay attention. This is all connected economically.
There is no contest. Why am I telling you this? Because the United States' reaction, and that of Europe as well, to the rise of China and the BRICS has been a major adjustment in the direction of wanting the activity of an authoritarian state. In the place of neoliberalism and globalization, we are turning to economic nationalism. Here are some of the signs that I'm sure you've noticed. The United States is demonizing China, top to bottom, reminiscent of the Cold War when that was done to the Soviet Union. The United States is punishing selected Chinese companies. The United States government is threatening and sanctioning enterprises and governments around the world that trade with China. The United States is forbidding export of private companies' private outputs to China, particularly in the area of microchips. I could go on. President Trump hit China with tariffs, making every Chinese product more expensive in the United States because you had to pay not only the price of the good, but the tariff tax added by the United States on top of it.
You see how they try to ruin other countries that they consider to be a competition economically? This is insane when you think about this. Is the information that you're hearing from Professor Richard Wolff. This is what mainstream media is not telling you when they talk about China. They make it seem like China is just this huge, big, bad boogeyman that just wants to come after the United States. For the most part, they're not even thinking about us. They got their own stuff going on. They don't need us. We need them more than they need us. Economically, yes, armed and hammered. Wolfowitz doctrine. Thank you. Yes, the Wolfowitz doctrine, which basically says that no other country can rise to that power that is only for the United States. Isn't this some crazy shit? When you hear about it, it's crazy. It's insane. You're not allowed to have any competition economically. And look where this has gotten us as a country.
We have trade wars. The Biden administration has continued them. There is a governmental interference in our economy, which would have made earlier generations totally outraged because it violates the notion that private capitalism is best left alone by a non-interfering, non-intervening government. Well, that's only the beginning of the story. The reality is that the United States is empire, the building up of which happened particularly after the Second World War, when the United States replaced the old colonial masters in Western Europe and Japan with its new informal empire. We didn't have colonies, with a few exceptions, but we very similarly managed. The United States has hundreds of military bases around the world in a way no other country has.
Regime change, removing leaders in other countries and putting in the ones that the US government finds to be acceptable. The military bases. Do you need 800 military bases around the world? What if it were the other way around? What if it was China that had 800 military bases around the world and they were surrounding the United States? How would you feel? These are things I think a lot of times American people just don't think about. Like, it's just become so accepted. It's so normal in our society. Like, it's just okay for us to have this happen. It's not okay. Why is the United States, government policing the entire world? Who decided that the US would be number one and only the US can be number one? Who made these decisions? And I say this because you have to understand, when you see the way that some of these other leaders in other countries are pushing back on the US government, you have to understand why that is. It's not necessarily because they just want to bully us. It's because the US government has had their hand in the pockets of all these countries. And every time these countries try to get a little bit of success, here they come to snatch the money away. Why do you think a country like Haiti is so poor? Let's talk about this. A country like Haiti, which was rich in resources, the people there are so poor because the US government, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, sent the US Marines into Haiti, not only took over their businesses, but took over their banks. The US government did that, people. And then people ask, why are they coming here? Why are all these migrants coming here? Because there's nothing there. There's nothing left for them in these countries. The US government has destroyed these people in their countries. Look at Yemen. Can you live in Yemen right now? That's what it does. And anyone, especially if you are not one of their allies, but even if you are an ally, who's to say it won't come a time when the US government may not turn on the UK, may not turn on France? If Germany gets a little too successful, a little too happy, may not turn on Germany. You never know. We'll go on a little bit more here.
No other country comes close. We operate an empire, and that empire is in deep trouble. It's shrinking. The war the United States went into in Korea ended in a kind of stalemate, not a victory. The war in Vietnam, an attempt to maintain the empire over there, the United States was flat out defeated. In Afghanistan, again. In Iraq, basically, again. Much of the pressure leading the United States to be so actively involved in the Ukraine war is also an attempt to hold on to a dominant world position that is in trouble, is shrinking. Like every other empire in the history of the world, this one, having been born, having grown, having evolved, is now in decline.
Well said, Professor Richard Wolff. If you want to see the full video, because this video is over 58 minutes. It's on Democracy at Work. It's called Global Capitalism. Capitalism Turns to the Authoritarian State. Check that out. That was uploaded 3 days ago. You guys have got to see the full discussion. And I watched the entire video, but it's very powerful what Richard Wolff is saying there. And it's true. Like, it's in decline. That's why they're pressuring. You know, Russia is not innocent. Russia has its issues too. But the reason why you see them targeting countries like Russia, countries like China, they know that there's serious competition. China, if you look at the top 10 banks in the world, China has most of the top banks in the world on that list. I've shown it on the show multiple times. China does, not the US. The first time an American bank actually appears on that list is number 6, and that's JP Morgan. So you can guess who's in the top 5. Times have changed. Matthew said, have you noticed when wages increase, rents go up that much more? They don't really want you to get out of your situation. They'll give you a wage increase, but then also not just your rent will increase, but also your healthcare premiums increase. So are you really getting a raise? JB says the US is jealous of China and wants to sabotage them instead of competing fairly. It's like throwing a brick at the runner's feet while you're racing them because they're winning. Exactly. That's right. Thank you for the super chat, Chicka Boom Boom too. The US of Satan, the United States of Satan is a global nightmare over the earth.